Unicom's webinar on Managing Agile. Our presenter today is Graham Dick, who is the co-owner of Lamri. And Lamri is a specialist in the process improvement business. Graham has been involved with Agile and its evolution since the mid-1990s, and over the time has worked with many organizations, both small and very large, and assisting them to how to adopt and adapt Agile to ensure that they obtain full value from this approach. This talk is going to be based upon his experiences gained over the many years and with many different organizations. Graham is also speaking at our process improvement conference and the DevOps conference on 20th of November. So if you're interested to listen to him again, do get in touch with Unicom or with Graham. So it's over to Graham now. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Dira. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the talk. If you've got any questions while we're going through, we'll have a short kind of Q&A opportunity at the end of the talk, and you can kind of post your questions into the little control panel on the GoToWebinar device. Okay. Okay, what we're going to talk about today is kind of very brief. What's the history of Agile? Where's it come from? And kind of look at some of the kind of challenges of working with Agile in different environments, and look at some kind of approaches we can use and techniques we can use to kind of, if you like, kind of better adapt and fit Agile into more challenging environments. I mean, really, this talks about fitting into an organizational context which is sometimes ill-adapted to work to Agile's strengths and to exploit Agile strengths to the very best. So it's kind of like, well, okay, well, you know, in the ideal world, we'd change the organizational context and make it fit and work to the amazing power that Agile gives us. But unfortunately, sometimes, you know, we just basically haven't earned the right to actually have that discussion with the organization yet. So to a certain extent, it's, you know, we've either got to kind of give up and go home, or we're the ones who've got to change and adapt to try and make best use of what we've got, and, you know, and demonstrate the value that Agile delivers. Okay. I guess, you know, what I'm saying here is Agile absolutely has a sweet spot out of the box. You know, it's moderately sized to smaller, moderately sized projects. It's where we've got our development team. We can really get close to the end users, and also work closely and continuously with that end user community, you know, through the life of the project. It's about having an empowered product owner, someone who actually understands, grasps with, makes decisions about what is the vision, what's the vision for the solution we're building, and, you know, steer and drive it in that direction. And also it's that product owner and users with sufficient time to engage through the life of the project. You know, a bit of the traditional approach of engagement at the beginning, and then like, adios amigos, we'll see you at the end. Just, you know, it doesn't fly, it doesn't work. It's proven not to deliver. The massive power of Agile is running iterations, end of each iteration, demonstrable software that actually delivers value to the customer, and then feedback and, you know, mid-course correction opportunity at the end of each iteration, as we inevitably misunderstand stuff, get it fixed, move in the actual right direction that the users actually intend us to go with a solution. Okay, I guess kind of some classic Agile pitfalls is, you know, we kind of sometimes just kind of ignore the business as usual structures in the organization. You know, it's just an elephant trap. It's easy to do. I've done it myself. You kind of try and ignore the kind of existing governance that's there, try and ignore the PMO that's there, and just look, come on, we've got a new way of working. We're really excited about it. It delivers, and try and push that forward. And that can create friction, you know, which can make things difficult. Sometimes forgetting that, you know, actually, I've got Agile here, but what's it actually mean? How do I adapt it and tailor it to fit the particular context I'm in? You know, sometimes just running out the box isn't necessarily, you know, the right answer at a particular point in time. And also sometimes, it's certainly in larger organizations, there's just stuff that's in place. There's strategic delivery channels with offshore partners involved, and it's like, well, yes, we can kind of ignore that for ages, but sooner or later we've got to try and engage with those guys and actually work out, well, how can we actually exploit them to help us, bring the benefits of Agile to larger projects. I really like this chart. It's kind of because it's just kind of taking loads of different sort of dimensions on applying Agile methods, from kind of technical complexity through to the discipline of the enterprise, through to the complexity of the domain. And I think the interesting thing is each of these things is kind of on a continuum, really, from left to right, where you've got kind of like geographical distribution, for example. You've co-located on the left, global on the right. You've got organization and distribution down on the right there. It's kind of collaborative, going from collaborative through to contractual. And I think the interesting thing is that by and large, most of the industrial experience of Agile is on the left, is situations where you're on the left of this chart. And as you're in a situation which starts moving you to the right, like bigger distribution, like bigger team sizes, it's potentially, there's challenges there. Doesn't mean it's impossible, or it's just stuff you've got to start thinking about and think, well, actually, how do I adapt Agile to work in this context? Or how can I adapt the context to work better with Agile? I think absolute what has happened over the last probably 10, 15 years now is that Agile has now become very much, it's just, it's the way we do, it's becoming rapidly, the way we do stuff here. And I'm certainly seeing that as a business. We've got more and more, what we call our more traditional customers who are starting to kind of go, yeah, it's now no longer on the kind of the optional heap, but it's now actually on the, well, why aren't we doing Agile? Because it just makes sense. So it's no longer something that's exotic and esoteric. It's something that, well, it should be on the agenda. We are starting to do it, and how can we actually, the discussion's gone from like, well, should we, to actually, how can we make use of this approach over the wider organization, because it just makes sense. The interesting kind of thing to pause very briefly on here is that Agile is often thought of as being something relatively new. But actually, the principles underpinning Agile go way, way, way back. And I was doing a little bit of digging, and they actually go back to the 1960s. And the Project Mercury stuff, i.e., putting the first sort of American in orbit around the Earth, actually used principles of iterative and incremental development, building some of the mission control software for that project, which was a real surprise to me. I never dreamt these principles went back that far. So it's very interesting, I think, and perhaps something to be aware of now is that actually there's a whole set of toolbox of kind of techniques and approaches and variants that have been explored over the years, and that's all ripe for the picking. That's all ripe for stealing from, making use of, to put into our sort of development solution pot or toolbox that we use today. Okay, so very quick kind of recap, kind of, well, why does Agile work? What are the features of it that make it fly? Here's my quick little potted picture of of your typical Agile approach. You've got a development team, kind of got a Scrum Master whose job is to kind of help coordinate and organize and get obstacles out of the way, and to coach and mentor that team. We've got a product owner who's kind of acts as the bridge between our users and the development team. We've got a product backlog, which is a set of wish lists, all the stuff we would like the thing to do. We have a sprint planning meeting where we organize what we're going to do in an upcoming sprint, and then we run a sprint. And what's a sprint? It's a very short little batch of development work. It's taking some user features, some stuff off the backlog. It's expanding them at just in time, having those discussions with the users to say, what do we actually mean by this? And more importantly, how do we know when we have done it? So what's the test criteria? How are we actually going to test this particular feature? And then a bit of analysis, bit of design, bit of build, and then test it. And then at the end of that short block of time, somewhere between 1 and 4 weeks, what have we got? We've got a little slice of our system which we've built, and more importantly, we've tested. And really important there, we can actually go and review that with the customer. We can actually show them, do a demonstration. Immensely powerful technique, because it flushes out those misunderstandings that typically and traditionally get left, right towards the back end of the project. So we find them here really, really quickly, because inevitably we misunderstand stuff, and the customer misunderstands stuff as well, and misunderstands even his own needs. And it's only when he sees a solution that he goes, oh wow, yes, that's what I kind of meant. And also, there's retrospective, that opportunity to kind of feedback and learn what went well, what didn't go so well, what can we change, what can we do better next time. And I guess the key, one of the key things here, it's the old how do you eat an elephant syndrome, not in one great lump, but just a bite at a time. And that's to a certain extent what we're doing with Agile. We're breaking down the whole big problem of delivering a potentially quite a large, novel system into tiny little chunks, which we can address just chunk by chunk by chunk. And the key thing is each little chunk that we're building gives us absolutely fundamental feedback in terms of have we actually, are we going in the right direction? And if we're not going in the right direction, well, it's not a disaster. It's great. We've failed early. We've found out now before we spent a whole bunch of money. We can change direction and get the direction tuned in. So one of the interesting things about Agile, I always think, is that whereas a traditional project, we kind of tend to snowplow risk in front of us, and it's only right at the end of the project do you have more certainty about when you're going to deliver. And the kind of quality of what you're going to do. Whereas in an Agile project, you're actually getting that certainty is starting to increase very, very rapidly from very, very early on, simply because we're just actually producing production quality code really early, right from the very first sprint. And then we're actually showing that to a customer and getting them to effectively sign it off. So yeah, that's what I want. Or no, it isn't. We need to change it like this. Right, cool, we'll do that. So very powerful approach. Okay. In our, often our experience is that when we kind of look at a broader Agile deployment, sometimes some of the practicalities start getting in the way. Parts of the business are not as willing to engage with us as we'd like. We've got to embrace outsourcing. Sometimes you get people who start getting really kind of helpfully interested, and what I mean by that is the helpfully interested in terms of they're almost kind of getting in the way. And to a certain extent, it's because people are genuinely interested, but also people sometimes are very suspicious. What's this newfangled approach? What's it actually mean? How's it going to impact me? Is it going to damage my career path? And so, it's something to start thinking about in terms of actually I've got a bit of people management and expectation management to do here as we try and take Agile wider. Obviously, you start getting to the point where you're not actually cherry-picking your team anymore. You're not self-selecting, your bunch of passionate colleagues who are really passionate about it. You're actually getting everyone else now because you want to take this wider. And some of those guys are probably not quite as flexible and collaborative as we might like them to be, just because, again, it's the nature of the beast. And also, we're not going to really get to pick the projects anymore. We're just going to have, we really got to take Agile to, doing the lot, from the legacy system, which needs a bit of an upgrade, through to all sorts of other things. So it's we've got to work out, well, perhaps we need some variance in our Agile approaches to deal with these different types of projects. So I guess in terms of, well, what do we do in the real world then? I guess our kind of belief is you've just got to actually kind of accept the delivery context you're in. You've actually got to recognize it. Often, you've got strong organizational governance requirements that are kind of, to be blunt, horribly waterfall orientated, and the most agile, completely agile, unfriendly. And the trouble is, you just got to accept them initially. And we've got to accept that, initially anyway, until we've kind of won the kind of acceptance and the belief of the business that actually, that Agile works. Initially, we're just going to need the customer far more than he's going to be available. I've often been in with customers, and it's fascinating. You start having this discussion about, well, actually, I'd quite like your involvement right through this project, please, and this is why. Give them all the good reasons, and they just say, well, would you like to look at my diary? Here, have a look at my diary, and look, it's block booked, doing other stuff, and then you're into this, okay, maybe we can negotiate mode. Whilst we're kind of thinking about potentially adapting Agile, we've got to really hold on to its strengths, though, and not give those away. Empowered team, embracing change and feedback, and to some extent seeking every opportunity to embrace feedback. Embrace change because inevitably we get stuff wrong. The feedback tells us that, and then we change direction, and make best use we can of all customer contact opportunities. Especially as the systems get bigger, how do we actually make sure we keep continuously integrating that system as we're building it sprint by sprint, making sure we continuously integrate and test the whole, which is really important. And then also, as we're working through, obviously, make sure we hold on to the fact that, each sprint we not only repeatedly, we not only test the new stuff that's come out in the sprint, but also what about all the stuff that we built before? We've got a regression test, keep on testing. So it's really about doing the hard stuff early and making sure that when we get to the, towards the end of the project, you've actually regression tested stuff you did earlier so many times that you're actually massively confident in the quality of the end product. Okay, a bit of just kind of context and just kind of a quick reminder. What are we doing here? Well, often, we're building a product or a set of products. They're all about, underpinning some sort of business change or business, or new business solution that's going to be offered up to, at the end of the day, deliver revenue or deliver services to the business. And the key thing is kind of one of the key things, especially with large projects, is to actually keep an eye on what are the actual objectives of the leadership team, what has actually the project got to do, because that can be different from the view of the end users who might not quite see that big picture. So it's something that we have to keep an eye on. And also it's thinking in terms of, well, there'll be governance as we do bigger projects. There's governance involved there, and it's the trouble is, it feels like it can be desperately, constrictive and in the way, and oh, for crying out loud, what on earth is all this here for? But the trouble is, it's there for a good reason. At the end of the day, the leadership team, as far as they're concerned, is just simply they're making an investment in this stuff, and they want there's a return on investment. That's why they're doing it, and it's about confirming progress. And some element of confirming progress, and that's why they've got a governance structure in place. The interesting thing, of course, is that as our business solution involves perhaps touching one or more or many underlying products, each running to its own, to some extent, to its own agile heartbeat, we've got to worry about dependencies between those and across those. What combination of features need to be delivered at a particular point in time to allow, effectively an incremental service to be either demonstrated to the project sponsors or actually potentially released at a particular point. And I've bolted in here there's some statistics on the right there, which is taken from a company called Version 1. They do an annual state of agile development survey, which is very interesting, and I'd certainly urge you to go and have a look if you're interested. It's just talking about barriers to agile adoption, and some of the stuff, people are just kind of writing in and saying, well, over half of people said one of the big challenges is just to change organizational culture. It's really hard, and that's an element of a very waterfall focused governance is a big aspect of that organizational culture. It's just the organization's not ready to think agile. Okay, and I guess one thing we've kind of learned is that it's really, you just can't change the big picture. You can't change the whole organizational context really until we've actually demonstrated the utility and the efficacy of what we do. Yes, we believe Agile works. Yes, we know Agile works. But the larger business, it's just stuff they're hearing about. Until we've kind of earned the right to be heard, we've just got to play by their rules. So we've got to work with the organization rather than fighting against it, and it's the most effective way of getting change done. Work with it, demonstrate that this approach actually works, and then we can actually start slowly getting the organization to change. Thinking in terms of some of the stuff we're doing inside the approach now, a dear old product owner has an interesting perspective. He's kind of got to balance. There's two things here because he's got to balance kind of what the actual users are wanting from the solution, but also try and keep a kind of big picture leadership perspective in mind. What is the big picture? What are the key features from a business benefits perspective that are required, and when are they required? Traditionally and classically, you tend to just worry about functionality. What features do we need and when? And it's easy to forget or to take your eye off the ball of thinking about, well, what about time and time dependencies? What about dependencies between components or between subsystems? What about dependencies even between projects and between business process and operational needs? All stuff you've got to kind of think in then. What these dependencies may well do is they may well actually alter the order we deliver particular functionality in. So we need to think about that. So building the product, what do? Well, answer. Obviously, we build it over, we incrementally and iteratively build a product up over a number of sprints of short iterations of 1 to 4 weeks or so. But what happens when, as we're working through, we start introducing complexity and scale? Product backlog builds in complexity. We start saying, well, actually, we need, rather than just one team, we need multiple teams involved in this. What happens when actually we haven't really got enough product owners to go around? What happens when we've got the risk that the product owners start to diverge from the vision? How do we allocate the backlog across all those teams? And what about performing systems integration in the sprint? That's an interesting one, isn't it? Because an individual team integrates the stuff it's doing. Who actually gets to integrate the overall end-to-end system and pull all that together? Someone's got to worry about that, because clearly, you've got to think in terms of your definition of done. Done often actually is, I've actually put the entire contents of sprint into configuration management. I've built the entire system as it stands to date. I've tested it all, and I've regression tested up to date. And often deployed it on some sort of deployment or test box as well. So when you start to talk multi-teams, who gets to think about all that? What if some of those developers are in a third party? And then also, when you start getting multi-teams in there, thinking about what about reuse? What about actually, maybe we need some direction, because what happens if teams solve sort of mechanistic problems in multiple different ways? Well, that's a bit of a waste of time, isn't it? And how do we learn? How do we do cross-team learning as well? When one team starts going, well, actually, there's a better way of doing this. We can tune the approach better to fit our context. How do we actually share that information around across all the other teams as well? It's just something to think about there. And also then we kind of throw in some geographical distribution for good measure, and that can make that communication challenge tougher. Of course, the challenge is as we kind of grow up to a certain extent, then distribution sometimes becomes inevitable. We can get into this trap, and we've seen this with customers we've worked with, where actually I don't have enough engaged end users, and they don't all like the traveling all the time to make sure they're kind of co-located with teams. It just starts getting really hard. We've talked a bit about this already. Completing full systems integration within the sprint then becomes difficult. And the trouble is, as soon as you kind of compromise that, that's one of Agile's greatest strengths. You've kind of bung it out the window. So that's no good. Evolving understanding of the structure and integrity of the system starts becoming harder as well, because you're looking across. You've got multiple teams there, kind of exploring and evolving. How do we keep them kind of coordinated so they actually keep going in a kind of coordinated, coherent direction? That's something that we need to think about. And also just getting the teams organised and sorted such that they've who allocates requirements across all the teams. How do we ensure the feedback gets back over? So scale brings challenges. So in terms of kind of relearning, let's talk about relearning here. I mean, one of the things we can do is instead of thinking of architecture as, well, that's just something that's going to evolve, let's actually put the horse before the cart, and actually think in terms of, well, actually architecture is a first-class citizen, and we can use architecture or an idea of this is the structure of our system that's going to evolve as something to help direct and organize our development teams. We might need to think in terms of, okay, that kind of delivery life support environment we were talking about, like allocating features onto teams. Which do we just let teams pick features at random? Do we have some sort of system for allocating them onto teams, some sort of method? Then perhaps we need some sort of cross-functional team that will do that. absolutely, we also need to be able to listen to feedback and listen to improvements coming up from individual teams. Again, our cross-functional team can do that. Something we've come across, especially when you're working with third parties, is you've got to be really, really careful about what's our definition of done. And by definition of done, what I mean is you know, when is a sprint done actually? What do I have to have actually got achieved to have completed, you know, basically closed the sprint off? You know, is it just enough to have written my code and run some unit tests? Maybe that's done. Maybe I actually need to put everything back into configuration management and then checked it out onto another box and built it all from scratch and then run the tests for that, you know, for that sprint. Is that done? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe actually I need to do that, and then I also need to run regression tests to ensure that I haven't broken anything from previous sprints. Well, maybe that's done. Or maybe I also need, what about any documentation, any help guides, anything like that? Maybe that needs to be done as well. So really think about what a definition of done is, and that's absolutely key for bringing in third parties, because clearly third parties are going to want some sort of payment schedule, and often that payment schedule will be links around delivering features. And we're going to be absolutely certain that when they say we've delivered a feature, their definition of deliver is the same as our definition. Otherwise we get all sorts of challenges. You know, we're effectively then paying people to do stuff twice, which isn't clever. We need to think in terms of building and testing system as close to continuous as practically possible. So how can we make sure that we actually build and test as close to the end of the sprint as possible? Something we can do as well is think in terms of, well, inevitably we'll build up technical debt, you know, stuff that we just got to fix and change through the life of the project. And so sometimes it's worth, especially in a large project, thinking in terms of just planning some time for technical debt, because we know it's going to happen. And so having you know, some time in there to do that, to actually deal with that, can be quite helpful. And also kind of planning. It's not anathema to an agile project. We can plan in engagement with existing governments, work out how we're going to do this. It's not difficult. You know, we can plan for benefits and dependencies. When are we actually going to deliver particular benefits? And at which point do dependencies become critical and lock in? You know, this will change over time. Of course it will. But you know, as we become more experienced in what we're delivering. But there's nothing wrong with actually relatively early in the project actually having a vision, having a view of this is what it looks like going forward. This is where we deliver key features. And this is where we have key dependencies locking together to enable features. So looking at governance here, you know, here's my some sort of daft governance scheme on the top there. You know, and it's reasonably typical, some sort of startup, feasibility, delivery, closure kind of life cycle. And at their view that you kind of have got a bunch of grand delivery and grand design going on and some final massive implementation, you know, with a pre-implementation review. But how do we actually map Agile into that? Well, one thing we can do is we can synchronize our sprints with governance boundaries, because that starts making things tidier. We can look at our sprint reviews, end every sprint, look at the review there, look at the information and the data we're getting out of that, and actually how can we use that information to help us you know, provide the information that our governance scheme is requiring. And I guess it's thinking about, well, the governance isn't there for, you know, it's not there for nonsense. It's there because actually it's a proxy for earned value. It's actually asking the kind of question, have I done enough given the spend to date? You know, and am I on track to deliver what's actually needed? And I think one of the nice things about Agile is, to a certain extent, it gives a fantastically crisp answer to that. Because rather than saying, well, actually, you know, I've got a lovely big design document and I've got loads of source code written, but I haven't actually integrated it or tested it yet. I can actually say, well, we've got this set of features, they're built, they're thoroughly tested, they work, you know, we've had user demonstrations with them, they're the right features, and we can, you know, and we can deploy them because we put them into put them onto a clean test box at the end of each sprint to thoroughly test. That's a massive demonstration of earned value of what we've actually delivered for the spend to date. think in terms as well that sometimes the governance requirements is placing kind of mandatory requirements on what we need to do in the sprint. Sometimes, unfortunately, you just got to produce an architecture document. Sounds awful, but think smartly about it. And sometimes it's just initially in Agile adoption, you're just going to have to go with things like that, and sometimes just work them in. Think in terms of dependencies. We sometimes get business critical dependencies in terms of how to get a bit of functionality released at a particular, or available at a particular point to meet the needs of a business case. Sometimes we've got functionality which is there to enable some feature in a related system or subsystem. So we can think in terms of we can map these things out over time when we're actually planning. Certainly at the early stage of the project, map them out over time. Map when functionality will be delivered. Obviously the content of early sprints is more rigorously tested because we're repeating and regression testing each sprint. To build this sort of view, you're going to require collaboration between the business and the technical, between our team and also the business, which is fine. And obviously, it's going to change as we learn more. Yes, stuff changes, and that's fine, and we've got to welcome change. So lay out a plan for a delivery plan like this, and it's about making things happen according to some the required timelines. We do have flexibility and discretion within the framework, and obviously we've got to have really close collaboration. We've got to listen to our teams, and when they say they can't do it, we work with them to understand why it doesn't work. We just kind of crash and impose this sort of structure on our teams. But it's got, it has its positives as well. One of the interesting things is obviously if we've got key functionality scheduled and it's not happening, well, it's a great early warning sign. What's actually going on there? Perhaps what it is actually we just need to do a replan because we've critically underestimated our velocity for all sorts of reasons. Well, that's fine. Maybe there's something else going on that we haven't anticipated. But the beauty of the approach, the Agile approach, is it gives us early warning about things. Something else we've found is really useful is we can actually kind of provide focus to our sprints. So we can have some very early work in the overall life cycle of the project, which is about kind of focus on what's the scope of the thing we're building, what are the key non-functional requirements, performance, security, usability, that sort of thing. What about contracts with third parties, getting those sorted out, maybe some technical prototypes to prove some key technologies. We can then kind of get into a kind of can we build it type of phase. And what we're doing here is we're kind of cherry-picking particular stories that will allow us to basically drill steel threads down through our, basically through our solution stack, prove that our solution architecture or proposed solution architecture is up to the job, give us a framework on which we can kind of actually do some scalability testing, some performance testing, and actually demonstrate to ourselves that, yeah, we've got a solution architecture here that will deliver what our project needs to deliver. We can test our supply chain end to end, exercise the approach. We've got multiple teams working together. Actually, exercise how are we all going to work together. Actually, test that approach and get it working. And the interesting point is when we kind of work a little bit through there, what we find is that we actually get a scalability point. We've actually got an architecture, a solutions framework and structure that is, to a certain extent, is tested. We know it will scale. We understand the shape of the solution. We just don't understand all the details, but we can actually scale at this point and start bringing in and start expanding. So, for example, individual teams now own particular subsystems in the solution architecture, and you work with them. So that gives an interesting point where we can potentially scale there. And then we can move into kind of a build it phase where actually now we're focusing, we don't need to worry so much about the structure of the beast. We've worked that one out. Now it's about focusing on functionality and delivery of functionality. And then lastly, a business as usual phase where it's about closing down the development project and completing the transition to operations. Risk can be really useful, thinking about risk. One of the, again, you know, we can exploit the power of iterative and incremental delivery here to actually drive out technical risk early, to de-risk our project. You know, how do we do that? You can identify, we can think in terms of our potential solution stack, think of the solution space, think about what we're being asked to do, identify a number of technical risks, and then we can simply map those to particular stories, to user stories. And we've got user stories allocated over a number of iterations or sprints. And then as we actually deliver those stories, we're actually mitigating that technical risk. We're actually proving that the risk either has blown up in our face and has become an issue because a particular element of the solution stack isn't fit for purpose, for the purpose we wanted it, or actually, well, no, it does work, and we've made it work. And so the great thing is we're actually, over a relatively short period of time, we can drive a lot of the technical risk out of the project, so stabilizing the remainder of the delivery and actually, you know, meaning we're less likely to be kind of unpleasantly surprised by things going wrong. Architecture is really useful because we can think about it if we actually kind of sketch out, and this doesn't have to be a massively intensive, you know, unified modeling language drama. You know, we can sketch this out on big sheets of paper on the wall, and I've done this in the past many a time. Just sketch out an architecture on the wall and identify what the interfaces are between architectural components. And when we've done that, we can use that as a kind of vehicle to allocate teams. You know, we can give teams responsibility for particular subsystems through the architecture. That's, you know, that's one approach we can use. We can know then, you know, in terms of, well, what teams need to collaborate to deliver a particular user story. So we can work out, say, okay, to deliver user story 3 there, we actually, you know, each of these teams, blobbed in green, needs to do something critical to make that story happen. You know, here's another story, and, you know, you get a different little matrix slicing down through the architecture. So it's kind of useful thinking about the big picture there. What happens when we get multiple teams involved? Well, I guess one of the things you've got to kind of worry about is you've got to worry about throughput, because actually what we want is we want the teams busy, we want them working to a nice heartbeat. So we're going to make sure that, you know, we can feed each team at each stage. So we're ready to have those conversations about stories that are allocated to teams. We're able to allocate stories to teams without kind of putting a big pause in there. We want to try and keep this thing as agile as possible. And if we get kind of stuff building up, blocking up on a particular team, then, well, that's an early warning. You know, something's going wrong there. How do we do this? Well, often what we've done in the past when we work with this is you've got to think in terms of kind of a program team. Someone's got to have the big picture and maintain the big picture. You know, plan stages and iterations, establish and maintain architecture. You know, just allocate requirements onto teams. Look at the performance of the whole. You know, what is our velocity as well? You know, what's the, you know, the velocity of the whole as it's moving forward. Look at contracts. So we've got some of the teams that are actually third parties. You've got to actually manage those contracts on an ongoing basis. Someone's got to do the end-to-end integration. Often, you know, a program team is a great place to put that, and then the end-to-end test as well, the non-functional requirements testing. What do my development teams then? Well, they do what they do. They develop individual modules or individual user stories. They're driving, you know, continuously integrating their modules and testing their modules. And often you've got some sort of business analyst from a program team is allocated as a liaison point for kind of 2 or 3 teams. So you can share a BA or a product owner across 2 or 3 teams and keep coordinated and organized through the idea of the program team. Looking at kind of, well, what about end-to-end integration and test? If you've got a number of teams running in each sprint, you know, running in parallel, that can be interesting because each team will test their own subsystem or their slice of functionality, but who kind of does the full end-to-end, who builds the full end-to-end? Well, sometimes what you have to do is, again, as I said, it's our program team gets that responsibility, but sometimes you've actually got to slip that full end-to-end test into the next iteration. So for example here, sprint 1, actually we're doing the final end-to-end integration and regression test actually during the time where sprint 2 is going on. So things slip by one iteration. So if there's an issue found in the big picture kind of issue found there, actually it doesn't get addressed until sprint 3. So it slips. Issue addressing does slip, but this will work with multiple teams. We've used this before on very large projects where you've got 30 or 40 Scrum teams working in parallel with third parties involved as well, and that's where this sort of approach comes into its own. What about in terms of, remember, just kind of feeding the teams and providing space for thinking and architecture? Well, what we need to do is we need to gain thinking advance. So sprint 2, we can basically work out, well, what requirements we're going to deliver in sprint 2, what any elaboration of architectural requirements that are required, or replanning happens in sprint 1. That then gets consumed in sprint 2, and then the product of sprint 2 are actually finally bolted together and end-to-end tested in sprint 3. So you kind of get it's kind of a diagonal life cycle starts creeping in there. And then kind of towards the end here, just thinking in terms of what about collaboration? Often, in organizations that are kind of new to Agile or starting to just want to scale it wider. I mean, the key thing about Agile is it's all about not exhaustively writing down our requirements up front, because it's just really hard to do that. It's that recognition that's really hard. Everyone finds that difficult, and it's error prone. So what we do is we actually write just enough requirements. The user story is a fantastic vehicle for that. It's this promise to communicate at a later date, and we do the communication when it's fresh at the point of consumption, have a dialogue between product owner, be it user, and developer and tester, and actually come up with, this is what we actually want the thing to do at this point, and then actually crystallize that, test it, code it, test it, and actually ask the question, does this meet our needs, there and then. But that demands constant collaboration, or pretty regular collaboration anyway, to actually make that fly and make it work. But the beauty of it is we're much more likely to actually deliver the right product using that approach. The trouble is what happens when we don't have that engagement that we wanted with our user community. The risk then is we ain't getting the engagement, therefore we're not discovering where we've inevitably got stuff wrong or misunderstood stuff. And so that's where we start creeping in, where we're either going to deliver something that's substandard or something that's going to require expensive rework, late in the project life cycle, which is a pain. We're losing the benefits there. And, to a certain extent, there's no real magic answer to this. Somehow you've got to try and keep collaboration high, or just make more effective use of the collaboration you've got. Maybe we've got to look at supplementing our user stories with outlined or detailed use cases as appropriate. Maybe what we can do is we can actually schedule in blocks of time from our user community and actually book them in over time. So we don't get them all the time, but we get them in blasts of kind of time where we can use them effectively to look at what we're doing in a particular sprint. But it's really sometimes you just got to wrestle with that and see how you can get the best collaboration you can. Kind of in summary, really, this kind of chart is trying to just show a mapping between a kind of complexity, if you like, and kind of size, and just trying to make the point that there's an area where you've got stuff on the bottom left there, really, really simple projects where it kind of doesn't really matter. And then there's a whole tranche of area where actually you're starting to get more complex, more novel problems to solve, and also we're starting to get, the project is getting, the solution is getting bigger and bigger, but we're in this kind of Agile sweet spot, an area where Agile absolutely sings and works beautifully. Then as we get bigger, perhaps we're solving a bigger and bigger problem. Well, we're into this Agile adaption zone. And lastly, we can get to a point where actually we get really, really huge or really, really complex, or stuff is just kind of doomed to be really difficult, and we've got that, it's the fragile zone, shall we say. And I think the key thing to think about is oops, sorry, I beg your pardon, is to think in terms of, well, recognize when you're in that fragile zone, and actually what can I change to get back into my agile adaptation zone at the very least. So where am I get to the point where actually no, stuff's just getting broken, and then recognize that stuff's broken and try and spool back out of that somehow. Okay, and lastly, as the last slide, I just wanted to mention this is something we've got involved with as a business recently, well, about last year, a group called IC Agile, an agile certification body. And I think one of the things that fascinates me about them, what they've done is they've kind of worked out an agile roadmap, really, which is about taking agile into the various disciplines that you often find in a large organization. So they're thought in terms of what's agile mean for my business analyst or product owner community. So they've got a value management stream. What's it mean from a management, project management and program management community? So there's an agile management stream. What's it mean for the folk amongst us who actually are really interested in coaching agile and taking agile wider? So there's an agile coaching stream. Our developers, agile development, our testers, agile testing, and then our leadership team, senior managers, there's an agile leadership stream. So there's an interesting approach here to thinking in terms of taking your agile education wider. Okay, so let's close that off.